Hi everyone, it's Keris here from Open Handed Theatre. Thank you so much for watching a trans fairy tale. These are some of the most common questions I get asked about the show. So if you haven't watched it already, make sure you do. And here we go. So I started writing it back in 2018. So I had this idea, first of all, of a fairy godmother who was just very bad at her job, and it was just going to be kind of a straightforward comedy. At the time I was dating someone, and after about a month it ended. And it ended partly because of my gender, and it really tore me apart, and it just made me feel like, as a trans person, I didn't know what my role was in the world, and so I wrote Trans Fairy Tale to try and figure that out in my own mind. And it just seemed like the two ideas went together very well. I think a lot of fairy tales always have this idea that to be happy you need to be in a relationship, and so I wanted to find out, is there any other way to be happy? First of all, I should say that I am a massive puppet nerd, and I want to include puppetry in pretty much everything I do, so it was an easy decision to make. But it's, for me, puppetry is a way of being able to express things that you can't do with normal speech, and in particular, a puppet can say things that a human, it would be very difficult to watch. So some of the transphobic language and some of the kind of issues we talk about in the show, it might be harder for a person to see, to do that. So I don't actually think that trans people aren't brave. I think trans people are very brave. But for me, it's always been a thing that people have said to me and has always bothered me about my transition. When I transitioned, I never wanted to do it because it was a brave thing to do. It was just because of who I am. And if the world, I think, was completely equal and everybody just accepted trans people for who they are, that we wouldn't be using words like brave. So I think it goes back to that thing where we expect people to conform without changing the structural issues in the world still. So I think if someone was wanting to be more supportive to the trans community, perhaps maybe treating every person as an individual might be a way forward. So non-binary means identifying as something other than traditional male and female gender roles. And I'm not non-binary, so for me it was more difficult to kind of talk about trans issues from that perspective. So obviously there's lots of different ways of experiencing being trans, you know, whether you're a trans person of colour or whether you're trans and disabled, even if you're trans and lesbian, and it was never something that to be honest, I have that experience in, so I never wanted to offend someone by talking about it incorrectly. When I finished the first draft of the script, I sent it to some non-binary writers to get their opinion, and some of the expressions used in the first draft, so for example, being born in the wrong body, because that's something that I very much feel. Some of the people who are non-binary didn't necessarily resonate with that, so I changed it. I feel like my responsibility is to sort of allow people who do have those experiences to write about it, particularly if it's a one-person show. I should say that I love drag so much, and my opinions aren't always the same as the characters. I think one thing that has bothered me is that for some people, maybe it's transphobia, maybe it's not, but being compared to drag queens. And I want to talk about that because there are some similarities. Obviously, we're part of the LGBT community, and you know, we might have similar experiences of being clocked. I think in the sort of more traditional gay world, it could be seen as being easier if you are able to take off the drag. But then again, with drag, there's so much wrapped in around the trans community, and many drag queens do identify as trans, and many drag kings identify as trans. So I don't think that there's a lot of differences between us, but I think someone like the Fairy Godmother, who's been oppressed for a long time, would look at that and resent them more because of it. So for me, I feel like the point of the show is that there isn't one way of living a life, and I think there's no need to compare the way that we live our lives to someone else, and particularly if we are from the LGBT community. We don't have to have the same experiences that people who aren't LGBT the way that they feel, and I think that there's more to life than being happy, if that makes sense. I'm not saying that we should all be miserable, but I think actually trying to pursue happiness sometimes is problematic and means that you actually miss out on more experiences that give you a wider range of emotions and feelings, and that happiness isn't a binary concept, just like gender isn't. There's no like happy and unhappy. I think there's such a grey area in the middle.